All right, chapter 18 starts out with talking about evolution, defining it, defining natural selection, and then talking about some types of evidence that support evolution. And that's kind of where we're headed. And so those keywords there, those are related to that evidence. And I've got a couple pictures of two different species of tortoises. One's the box tortoise from the United States, and the other's a Galapagos tortoise. Okay, and when we talk about evolution, we really first need to talk about what is a theory. Okay, that in science we have these definitions that are really, really important and they drive science. A theory is an idea that's been tested. It's an idea that explains all existing observations of the natural world in this area. It has made testable predictions, and the theory is supported by evidence. It's not contradicted by any available evidence. So, then my little cartoon there is kind of talks about conspiracy theories, where people have an idea, but that it's not related to evidence. Okay, in science, the term theory always implies a standard, a high standard of evidence that supports it and doesn't go against it. So, evolution and natural selection are two of the most important ideas in biology. And they have very specific meanings that are different from sometimes what you see in the popular press. Evolution, the term biological evolution, refers to genetic changes that occur in a population of organisms over time. It's the change in the frequency of alleles, okay, alternate versions of genes. Okay, over time, these things will change. This is a historical process that's led to the diversity of life and to the development of new adaptations and new species. The primary way that evolution occurs is by natural selection. And here, this is again a very specific definition. In biology, this means the differential reproduction of individuals caused by factors in the environment and leads to genetic changes in the populations. Okay? It's not survival of the fittest. What it means is individuals with the genes that are best suited for that environment will leave more offspring. Okay? I have a good example of evolution that people are probably aware of, and you can really see evolution occurring. And the example is insecticides. Okay, when we use insecticides and or herbicides, the more we use them, they kill individuals that are susceptible. And the most resistant individuals are the ones most likely to breed. And so over time, resistance to the insecticide or herbicide develops. Okay, and it spreads throughout the population. So we have to change our pesticides over time. Okay, so this genetic change in populations, this relies on existing variation in the population, that the variation is at least partially genetically transmitted. Okay, so it can go from parent to offspring, and that these different varieties differ in their reproductive success. Okay, and so some of them will lead to having more offspring. Okay, and what we know about this is that this has some long-term implications. Species may become extinct. They may change over time so that new species arise from old species, and new adaptations may arise. Existing structures may be modified so that they can develop and take on new functions. Okay, and we see lots of evidence for this. So here we have the forelimb in four different animals. Has the same number of bones, just modified. When we talk about evolution, we also sometimes talk about scale. Okay, microevolution is easily measured. This occurs over a short period of time in a single population, and it's change in one species. So this is like my example with insects and the insecticide that is used to control them. We see these happen over the lifespan of one human being. Macroevolution, it takes a longer time scale, and this happens over large regions over the entire world, and it leads to new species and new adaptations. Okay, And what's really important about these definitions is that they're supported by evidence. Okay? In science, we're like little detectives. We're looking for evidence, and based on the evidence is where we make our final conclusions. And so I'm going to talk about a bunch of different types of evidence here. Most are talked about in your book, some aren't, I'll mention that. But these are the types of evidence that was important to Darwin and to Wallace. And there's lots and lots of evidence all pointing in the same direction. And so that's what makes a theory. Okay, one of the most important pieces of evidence that was well known in England at the time was that artificial selection worked. That humans could select desirable traits and control the breeding of dogs, cats, horses, cows, sheep, even domesticated plants like corn and wheat, and they could change them. They could improve the yield. And the British agricultural revolution was well known. It happened 100 years before Darwin and was still going on. They were getting better and better at selectively breeding organisms. And that they could was a strong indication that organisms could change on their own. Okay, if humans weren't involved, that didn't mean change couldn't happen. It just had to happen on its own. We see lots of examples of this. Most of our breeds of dog are relatively new. We can trace back the origin of these breeds. And eventually we can trace them all the back to wolves, but more recently we can trace them back to dogs in the 1600s. And they were bred for specific purposes that were well documented. We can also trace back how we changed the grass teosinte into modern corn, where we have this huge ear of the grass plant that produces corn. And so we can select these, and different varieties are selected for the size of the ear, for how much oil they produce, for the yield. We can even domesticate animals like foxes. And so we've run experiments, and we can show that we can change the physical traits of foxes. We can breed them so that they like people and they act just like dogs. There have been experiments done where they breed fruit flies. Okay, and they can select them and control the breeding, and they can change populations over time. And so this has been well documented, and they can change them in all sorts of characteristics. Okay, right. In addition, we can see evidence of evolution in the fossil record. Okay, the fossil record, we can use the layers of strata to get an idea of how old things are. We can also use radioactive decay, and we can clearly see that there was change over time. That the oldest fossils were the simplest, and they were the smallest, and they were bacteria. And gradually fossils became more and more complex with increasing similarity to animals. And there's also fossils of intermediates, where no existing animals today live that are intermediate, but we can find fossil intermediates. This is one of the most famous ones. It's Archaeopteryx, a fossil that kind of looks like a bird, kind of looks like a reptile. It's an intermediate. It's an animal with feathers that had a bony tail and teeth in its mouth and no beak. Probably could fly, but not all that well. We can also look at geologic time to see how old the Earth is and when these fossils were occurring. We can use tree ring data to go back about 100,000 years because we have buried pieces of wood. We can use radioactive half-life. Radioactive elements decay over time, and we can measure how much of the parent element is there versus the daughter isotopes, and we can say how long that's been there. Okay. Other types of evidence deal with anatomy of organisms and a concept called homology. Homologous structures are similar because they are inherited from a common ancestor. They come by common descent. And we can tell this because they form from the same embryonic tissues, and we can see the same genes are active. And so I mentioned the forelimbs of different animals have the same elements, and they form in the same way, and the same genes are active. And they've actually done genetic experiments, and they can move whole structures like this by activating groups of genes at the right time. We can also see, compare how organisms develop, and we can see similarities between major groups like fish and amphibians. Even mammals look early on, they look very much like fish. And so this shows that there's these early development is kind of conserved, and then it's changed over time. We also see evolution modifying existing structures to produce workable but imperfect solutions. So these are the solutions that an engineer would never design, but it seems to work. And so a good example is like the long neck of giraffes. They're somehow genetically constrained to have 7 neck vertebrae like all mammals. That's not so great for a long neck. The only way you can do that is to make the vertebrae really elongate. A better solution would be the same solution you'd see in reptiles or geese, just to have extra neck vertebrae, but that's not limited or not available to mammals. Likewise, the eyes of vertebrates are really poorly designed, but it works. Okay, our photoreceptors face backwards, and so here on the left there is a human eye, and it shows you that light has to pass through nerve cells to hit the photoreceptors. Okay, seems kind of goofy, but it works. But we have a blind spot in our eye, and we have internal shadows in our eye that our brain has to kind of figure out. On the other hand, the eyes of squid and octopi have their receptors facing outward. And so they don't have those internal shadows. But it's they have other problems. Their genes are negative in other ways. Okay, another anatomical feature that's kind of cool is vestigial structures. These are structures that were functional in ancestors, but aren't active in the adult animal anymore. These include things like the hip bones in whales, the appendix in gills in humans, legs in snakes. These structures were needed in ancestors, but really serve no purpose. But we see them. We have hip bones in whales, those kinds of things. So that's a quick tour of some of the evidence that backs up evolution. Okay, there's these multiple lines of evidence, and I didn't talk about the molecular stuff, but we can go into DNA sequence and protein structures, and those things all support evolution. And so we have all this evidence that we really can't explain any other way other than common ancestry and descent with modification. And so that's where we're at. Okay, sounds good. We'll have more programs next week on evolution.